All right, what I'd like to do today is two things. One, in abbreviated form, to sum up what I was going to say on Friday last concerning Spinoza on reason and emotion. I gathered from the discussion that you are getting to feel fairly familiar with the main contours of Spinoza's thought, and so we can summarize that rather readily. Then get started into Leibniz, who occupies us for the rest of this week. So, on reason and emotion then in Spinoza, there are four things that I've written on the board that I want to stress. Not the same outline as I had up there on Friday, because I decided to abbreviate, condense, but this, I think, is it. As I recall, we got into the discussion by talking about Spinoza's determinism, which is presupposed in his view of both reason and the emotions. And we can see that quite readily when we note his definition of an emotion, which you can check for yourself if you want. It's on 134 in the anthology. An emotion is a bodily modification increasing or decreasing its active power. Now, a couple of things to underscore in that. First, that an emotion is physically based. Okay, it's a bodily modification. A modification being a temporary mode of bodily being. Remember, finite modes. So an emotion is a temporary mode of one's bodily existence. And it has to do with the active power of the body, either increasing or decreasing it. Power of the body? Yes, the causal energy with which one bodily state is followed by another bodily state. So when the adrenaline flows, the power is increased. When you feel utterly dejected emotionally, the power is reduced. An emotion is a bodily modification increasing or decreasing active power. Now that's his basic definition. So it's apparent that emotions then are physically caused, but keep in mind that the parallel, the accompaniment of every bodily change is the other aspect of our being. That is to say, if thought and physical extension are the two attributes of being, then there is corresponding to the physical emotion a changing state of consciousness, which we feel. And so if we're talking of emotions as we're conscious of them, we're talking of feelings. Or if the emotions act on us mentally, we tend to call them passions, in which we're passive, mentally passive. So a bodily modification increasing or decreasing the active power of the body, and accompanied by a changing state of consciousness. Now, he's very explicit in the context in talking about both about both will and intellect being involved in the conscious side of the process. But the emotion is basically a physical thing, and we talked of it last time in the discussion in terms of what Spinoza calls conatus, that driving energy that we associate with willing or wanting or desiring various conative functions, as we call them in psychological language, the conative. So emotion, then, is what underlies that. Appetite, yes. And in the conscious life, wanting and willing is the way in which we refer to these emotional states. Wanting or not wanting, liking or disliking, so forth. So definition of emotion, then, fairly clear. Now, the most significant thing about Spinoza's theory of the emotions is that the emotions hold us in bondage. And you may have noticed that the last two sections of his major work, the Ethics, are entitled respectively Human Bondage and Human Freedom. Sounds like an echo of what? Luther? Or something of that. But human bondage. Yes, because when in the consciousness we have inadequate ideas, that is to say, when we lack clarity and distinctness in our thinking, then what we have is a confused idea woven into the emotional feeling, and it is the emotional feeling that drives the consciousness rather than the clarity and distinctness which should rule. And so bondage to emotions, then, arises from the lack, the absence of clear and distinct ideas. And by the same token, freedom from being emotionally driven, human freedom comes with clear and distinct ideas. Clarity of thought dispels the passions that would otherwise drive us, rather than clear thought. So it's going to follow in the development of his ethics that virtue, and you can follow this through on pages 145, 148, so forth, a virtue is going to be a life ruled by reason rather than controlled by emotion. The rule of reason over emotion. Virtue is something which we acquire not by fear of evil, that would be emotion, emotionally driven, but only by virtue of clear, distinct understanding of the consequences of what we're doing or what we're about to embark on. And that life of reason, then, means that we have to gain clarity about the causal forces that are determining our circumstances. The causal forces at work in us physically, emotionally, the causal forces at work in the world around us, since all are part of the one all-inclusive substance. In other words, it is by understanding the causal mechanisms of nature and accepting them as given, something that we cannot contradict. It's in that acceptance of natural law that we find freedom from emotional upset. And here's where that Stoic ethic comes out, you see, because it's in that acceptance that there comes peace of mind. In that sense, virtue, living a life in accordance with reason, virtue is its own reward, and no future reward is needed. Virtue is its own reward. Now, he talks then of that rational acceptance. But an intellectual acceptance of the orderedness of nature is an intellectual acceptance of God or nature, one or the other. And in loving the ordered magnificence of nature, one is loving God. And so this highest state of virtue is what he speaks of as an intellectual love of God, simply enjoying the contemplation of the orderedness of nature and all the natural forces that are at work. Now, to speak of loving God in that way is obviously the language of Spinoza's Jewish heritage. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your mind, with all your strength. And so that's where he picks that up. But because he is the pantheist rather than a theist, item 4 necessarily follows that God has no passions. He is not affected by our love or our hate. God loves himself wholly, understanding himself in the totality of all clear thought, but he loves himself through our love for him. Now you see why that is. Because if God understands himself through those finite modes of thought which are our ideas, then God loves himself through those finite modes which are our love for God. So God does not love us. We're not a separate being to be loved. But God loves himself through our loving him. And so there is no reciprocation. How can there be from God when God is all in all, which includes us? Now, that's my summary of Spinoza's view of reason and the emotion. Do you want to mull that over for a little bit?